In the granite quarries of Yangshan, 20 kilometers from the Ming capital of Nanjing, a carved stone sits where it was shaped 600 years ago. The base section alone measures 73 meters in length. Its weight, calculated through modern volumetric analysis and material density testing, reaches 16,000 tons. For centuries, scholars described this as the failed Yangshan stele, a memorial monument commissioned by Emperor Yongle for his father that proved impossible to transport and was abandoned incomplete in the quarry. The explanation appeared in every survey of Ming Dynasty architecture and every history of Chinese imperial monuments. It was elegant. It was logical. It was, as engineering analysis would eventually demonstrate, built on a premise that had never been tested against the actual capacity of 15th century transport technology. The tradition of imperial steles in China extended back more than a millennium. These were upright stone monuments, rectangular in cross-section, inscribed with texts commemorating imperial achievements, recording official pronouncements, or marking sacred sites. They stood along spirit roads leading to imperial tombs, in temple complexes, at the sites of major construction projects. The largest steles of the Tang and Song dynasties reached heights of 10 to 15 meters and weights approaching 200 tons. The Ming Dynasty, drawing on this tradition, had already erected several monumental steles by the time Yongle commissioned the Yangshan project. The largest of these, standing along the Spirit Road at the Ming tombs north of Beijing, weighed approximately 200 tons and had been transported from quarries dozens of kilometers away using a combination of wooden rollers, sledges, and winter ice roads that reduced friction. The Yangshan Quarry, located in the hills 20 kilometers southeast of Nanjing, had been selected for the quality of its granite and its proximity to the capital. Granite was the preferred material for steles because of its durability and its capacity to hold fine inscriptions across centuries of weathering. The Yangshan deposit offered large, relatively homogeneous blocks with minimal fracturing, essential for a project of unprecedented scale. The plan, as reconstructed from the physical evidence at the site, called for a stele composed of 3 sections: a base section that would rest on a carved stone tortoise, a body section that would bear the inscribed text, and a head section carved with imperial dragons. The 3 sections together, before any carving began, represented more than 31,000 tons of raw granite. The workers began by isolating the stone from the surrounding bedrock. Channels were cut along the planned perimeter using iron chisels and wooden wedges soaked in water, which expanded as they absorbed moisture and split the stone along controlled lines. This was standard quarrying technique, documented in Chinese stoneworking manuals dating back to the Han Dynasty and practiced across Eurasia in various forms for millennia. The process was labor-intensive, but predictable. Once the block was separated from the bedrock on all sides, the carving could begin. The base section, the largest of the 3, was shaped to a length of 73 meters, a width of 14 meters, and a height of 13 meters. The body section was carved to 30 meters in length. The head section, the smallest, reached 10 meters. The surfaces of the stones show evidence of extensive finish work. The edges were beveled. Decorative relief patterns were begun on the head section. The inscribed panels on the body section were prepared, the stone smoothed to receive calligraphy that was never completed. This level of detail, archaeologists would later note, was inconsistent with a project abandoned in its early stages. Finishing work of this kind typically occurred late in the carving process, after the rough shaping had been completed and the stone had been inspected for structural integrity. The presence of polished surfaces and decorative elements suggested that the project had advanced well beyond initial excavation. Then, according to the orthodox account that dominated scholarship from the 15th century through the 20th century, the project stopped. The reason given in later historical texts was simple: the stone was too heavy to move. The base section alone, after carving, weighed 16,000 tons. No existing transport method could handle a load of that magnitude. The wooden rollers that had successfully moved 200-ton steelies would collapse under 16,000 tons. Sledges, even reinforced with bronze fittings, would fracture. Water transport, the method that had allowed the movement of massive stones in other cultures, required flotation capacity that could not be achieved with the raft and barge technology available in early 15th century China. The project in this reading was an act of imperial ambition that had exceeded the engineering capacity of the state. The stone was left in the quarry, the tools were abandoned, and subsequent Ming emperors commissioned more modestly scaled monuments. This explanation appeared logical. It fit the physical evidence. The stone remained in the quarry, unfinished, with no corresponding monument erected in Nanjing or anywhere else. It fit the historical context. The Yongle Emperor was known for ambitious projects that strained state resources, including the construction of the Forbidden City and the sponsorship of the Zheng He voyages. And a failed monument project was consistent with the pattern of overreach that historians had identified in his reign. The account was repeated in Chinese historical compilations, in European scholarship on Ming architecture, in archaeological surveys of the Nanjing region. By the 20th century, the Yangshan stele had become a standard example in discussions of pre-modern engineering failures, cited alongside projects like the unfinished obelisk at Aswan in Egypt as evidence that ancient ambition sometimes outpaced ancient capability. The explanation survived because no one had tested the underlying assumption. The claim that the stone was too heavy to move had been accepted as self-evident. 16,000 tons exceeded the capacity of known Ming-era transport methods by such a wide margin that detailed analysis seemed unnecessary. But the math had always been wrong, and the stone was not as unfinished as the textbooks claimed. The systematic re-examination of the Yangshan site began in the early 21st century when structural engineers and archaeologists returned to the quarry with laser scanning equipment, ground-penetrating radar, and the computational tools necessary to model material transport at scales that had not been analyzed in earlier surveys. The goal was not initially to overturn the orthodox explanation, but to document the site with precision sufficient to support comparative studies of stoneworking techniques across Chinese dynastic periods. What the survey revealed was a series of physical inconsistencies that the abandonment narrative could not explain. The first problem was the weight calculation itself. 16,000 tons represented a mass 80 times greater than the largest stele successfully transported during the Ming dynasty. The roller systems documented in Ming-era engineering manuals, which used hardwood logs reinforced with bronze sleeves, had demonstrated capacity for loads approaching 500 tons under optimal conditions. Beyond that threshold, the compression forces exceeded the structural limits of the wood, and the rollers would splinter under the load. Scaling up the system by increasing the diameter of the rollers or the number of rollers in parallel did not solve the problem. The contact pressure between the stone and the rollers increased proportionally with the load, and at 16,000 tons, even granite rollers would have fractured at the contact points. The engineering team calculated that moving the Yangshan base section on rollers would have required a system with no historical precedent and no clear path to construction using available materials. Water transport, the method that had allowed the movement of massive stones in other contexts, presented a different set of obstacles. Floating 16,000 tons required displacement of an equivalent mass of water. The barges and rafts documented in Ming River transport would have needed to be scaled to dimensions that exceeded anything built in Chinese naval architecture prior to the 20th century. The engineers calculated that a wooden barge capable of floating the base section would have measured at least 100 meters in length and 30 meters in width, with a draft deep enough to displace 16,000 tons. No river route between Yangshan and Nanjing offered the depth and width necessary for such a vessel. The canals that connected the Quarry region to the capital were engineered for commercial traffic and grain transport, with typical depths of 2 to 3 meters and widths of 15 to 20 meters. A barge of the required dimensions could not have navigated these waterways. Widening the canals would have required an excavation project larger in scope than the stele carving itself. Sledge transport, the third documented method for moving heavy stones in pre-modern China, faced similar limitations. Sledges functioned by distributing the weight of the stone across a broad wooden platform that slid over a prepared surface, typically lubricated with water or animal fat to reduce friction. The largest sledge transported stones in the Ming record weighed approximately 300 tons and required teams of several thousand laborers pulling on ropes in coordinated shifts. The force required to move a 16,000-ton load, even with optimal lubrication, exceeded the pulling capacity of any plausible labor force. The engineers calculated that moving the stone 1 kilometer would have required a sustained effort by more than 50,000 workers over a period of weeks, with continuous replacement of the wooden sledge components as they wore down under the load. No Ming-era logistical system could have sustained an operation of that scale. The second problem identified by the survey was the absence of transport infrastructure at the quarry site itself. If the stone had been intended for transport, the site should have shown evidence of preparation for extraction and movement. The engineers found ramps carved into the bedrock around the stone, but these ramps did not lead to any viable transport route. Several terminated at steep drop-offs where the quarry floor met the surrounding hillside. Others curved back toward the center of the quarry in configurations inconsistent with a hauling path. The ramps appeared to serve a different function. They provided access for workers to reach the upper surfaces of the stone during carving, and they created sight lines that allowed overseers to monitor progress from elevated positions. No evidence of roller tracks, sledge paths, or canal construction was found in the areas surrounding the quarry. The cleared ground that would have been necessary to stage a transport operation, the earthworks that would have supported a ramp system leading away from the quarry, the remains of the timber infrastructure that would have been required to build rollers or barges at the necessary scale. None of these features appeared in the archaeological record. The third problem was the finishing work. The surfaces of the stone showed tool marks consistent with advanced stages of carving. The edges had been chamfered. The decorative relief on the head section had been completed to a level of detail that required weeks of skilled labor. The body section bore smoothed panels prepared for inscription, with guidelines still visible where the text would have been carved. This was not the work of a project halted in its early stages. This was the work of a project that had proceeded through its planned phases and reached a point of near completion. If the stone had been recognized as too heavy to transport early in the process, the finishing work would not have been undertaken. The labor invested in polishing and decoration represented a significant fraction of the total effort, and that investment made no sense if the stone was destined to remain unfinished in the quarry. The engineering verdict was delivered in a series of technical reports published between 2015 and 2020. The numbers were impossible from the start. The weight of the stone exceeded the transport capacity of Ming-era technology by a margin so wide that no incremental improvement in technique or scale could have bridged the gap. The absence of transport infrastructure at the site indicated that no serious attempt to prepare for extraction had been made. The level of finishing work on the stone indicated that the project had reached completion rather than abandonment. The conclusion, stated carefully in the language of engineering analysis but unmistakable in its implications, was that the Yangshan stele had never been intended for transport. The stone was meant to remain where it was carved. The textbook explanation had collapsed. What replaced it required a different understanding of what the stone was for. The abandonment narrative had treated the stone as a failed monument, a project that overreached and was left incomplete. The evidence suggested something else. The stone was not incomplete. It was finished, and it was not abandoned. It was displayed. The quarry itself was the monument. The reinterpretation of the Yangshan stele required looking beyond the stone itself to the broader context of Ming statecraft and the functions that monumental projects served in early 15th century China. The Yongle Emperor's reign was defined by acts of imperial theater, projects designed not for practical utility, but for the demonstration of state power and technical capacity. The construction of the Forbidden City in Beijing, the sponsorship of the Zhenghe treasure fleets, the compilation of the Yongle Encyclopedia, the largest literary project in Chinese history to that date, all served to project an image of the Ming state as the preeminent power in East Asia and the rightful center of a tributary system that extended across the known world. The Yangshan stele, viewed in this context, fit the pattern not as a failure but as a deliberate act of spectacle. The hypothesis that emerged from the engineering analysis proposed that the stone was an in situ monument, a demonstration piece carved to showcase Ming technical mastery and left in the quarry as a permanent display. Comparable examples existed in other cultures. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan in Egypt, partially carved from bedrock and abandoned after a fracture appeared in the stone, had become a site visited by officials and travelers as evidence of pharaonic ambition and stone-working skill. Roman quarries in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean contained display stones, large blocks carved with decorative elements and left in place as advertisements of the quarry's capacity to produce monumental material. The Yangshan stone in this reading was not a monument that failed to reach its destination. It was a monument that had always been meant to stay where it was carved. The strategic logic of such a project was straightforward. The early 15th century was a period of intense competition among East Asian states. The Ming had recently expelled the Mongol Yuan dynasty and re-established Chinese rule over territories that had been under foreign control for nearly a century. Neighboring states, including Korea, Vietnam, and the various kingdoms of Southeast Asia, were being integrated into the tributary system through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic engagement. Demonstrating technical capacity was a form of statecraft, a stone that could not be moved by any known method, carved with precision and left as proof of what Ming engineers could accomplish, sent a message to tributary states, rival powers, and internal factions within China itself. The message was not that the Ming could build monuments. The message was that the Ming could do things that no one else could do, and that attempting to challenge Ming authority means confronting a state with resources and capabilities that exceeded the limits of ordinary engineering. Documentary evidence from the Ming period is sparse, and no surviving text explicitly describes the Yangshan stone as a demonstration project. However, the absence of transport logistics in the administrative records that do survive is notable. Ming bureaucratic archives contain detailed accounts of stone transport for other major projects, including the procurement and movement of steles for the Ming tombs, the transport of marble for palace construction in Beijing, and the logistics of canal excavation and bridge building across the empire. The Yangshan project appears in these records only as a quarrying operation, with expenditures recorded for labor and tools, but no corresponding entries for the transport infrastructure that would have been necessary if moving the stone had been the intent. The administrative silence on transport planning suggests that transport was never part of the project's scope. The finishing work on the stone supports the interpretation that the project was completed as intended. The polishing of surfaces, the carving of decorative elements, and the preparation of inscription panels were not the actions of workers abandoning a failed project. They were the actions of workers completing a display piece. The inscriptions, had they been completed, would have added a final layer of meaning to the monument, but the stone's primary function did not depend on the text. The function was the scale itself. Visitors to the quarry, whether foreign emissaries, tributary officials, or domestic bureaucrats, would have seen the stone and understood immediately that they were witnessing a demonstration of state capacity that exceeded anything their own governments could replicate. The quarry became a site of political theater, and the stone was the centerpiece of a performance that required no movement to achieve its effect. The concept of an immovable monument as a symbol of power has parallels in other cultural traditions. The massive stone heads of Easter Island, many of which remain in quarries rather than being transported to coastal platforms, functioned as demonstrations of chiefly authority and the capacity to mobilize labor on a scale that reinforced social hierarchies. The largest of these, known as Il Gigante, was left partially carved in the quarry and has been interpreted by archaeologists as a project intended to push the boundaries of what was technically possible, rather than to produce a functional monument. The Yangshan stone fits this category. It was a boundary marker, not in geographic terms, but in terms of technical possibility. It defined the outer limit of what could be carved, and by remaining in the quarry, it made that limit visible to anyone who visited the site. The stone's current status reflects the success of its original purpose. It remains in the Yangshan Quarry, now a protected archaeological site and tourist destination. Visitors walk along the ramps carved into the bedrock, stand on observation platforms built to provide views of the stone's full length, and read interpretive signs that explain the dimensions and the history. The experience that modern tourists have is not fundamentally different from the experience that a 15th century official would have had. The stone imposes itself on the viewer. The scale forces a recalibration of what seems possible. The fact that it has never moved, that it sits exactly where it was carved 600 years ago, is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the project succeeded in doing what it was designed to do. The stone was never meant to leave. It was meant to stay, and to make anyone who saw it understand that the state that carved it operated at a level beyond ordinary capacity. The Yangshan stele was not a monument to the Hongwu emperor. It was a monument to the Ming state itself, and the monument was not the inscribed text that was never completed. The monument was the act of carving a stone too large to move and leaving it in the ground as proof that the dynasty could do so. The failure narrative, which had dominated scholarship for 6 centuries, was a modern projection onto a pre-modern project that had different metrics for success. The stone was never meant to be moved. It was meant to prove that the Ming could carve anything and leave it there to make you wonder why they did.